I just smiled and refilled my water glass. That's all I did. My mother-in-law was mid-sentence, gesturing toward me with her salad fork, explaining to her sister that I help out at a vet clinic. Which isn't untrue, technically. I do work at a veterinary clinic. I'm also the chief of staff. But I just smiled and refilled my water glass. That was the Sunday dinner that started all of it. My husband's family, his mother, his father, his older brother, and a rotating cast of aunts and uncles who all seemed to share the same opinions about everything, had never quite known what to do with me. I'd been in their lives for 6 years by that point. 6 years of Sunday dinners at the house in Oakville, 6 years of Christmas at the cottage in Muskoka, 6 years of being introduced as our son's wife. She works with animals. Not that I expected them to understand what I did. Most people don't, not really. Veterinary medicine sounds soft until you're the one making the call at 2 in the morning. Until you're the one managing a staff of 42. Until you're the one who's been asked to sit on the Ontario Veterinary Medical Association's Disciplinary Review Board for the past 3 years running. But none of that was visible at the Sunday dinner table. What was visible was that I was quiet, that I wore my hair back, that I had ink stains on my fingers from paperwork I'd been doing in the car on the way over. She's very sweet, my mother-in-law told people. Very dedicated, she really loves those little animals. I am dedicated, that part is accurate. My husband, Theo. We'd been together since our 3rd year at Guelph, which is where we both went. Him for business, me for veterinary medicine. Had long ago stopped correcting his mother. Not out of cruelty, I don't think. More out of exhaustion. His mother had a way of absorbing corrections and then continuing on exactly as she had been, nodding with great patience until you were done speaking, and then resuming the sentence you'd interrupted. It wasn't meanness. It was just the particular confidence of a woman who had never had to update her understanding of the world. Because the world had always accommodated her existing understanding of it. His father was different, quieter, more watchful. He ran a commercial real estate firm in Burlington and had the kind of stillness that comes from spending decades reading people across boardroom tables. I always had the sense that he saw more than he let on. His older brother was the problem, not a dramatic problem, not a villain. Just the kind of man who takes up more space than he occupies. He worked in finance, lived in a very nice condo in downtown Toronto, and had strong opinions about everything from wine vintages to housing policy, to apparently the veterinary profession. It's a good living, he said to me that Sunday in the tone of someone complimenting a child's drawing. Steady. Not glamorous, obviously, but steady, I agreed. I imagine most of it is just routine stuff. Checkups, vaccines, mostly, I said. Right. He nodded, satisfied. It must be nice. Low pressure. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the emergency thoracic surgery I'd performed 3 days earlier on a German shepherd who'd been brought in at midnight with a ruptured diaphragm. I thought about the 14-hour day I'd had on Friday. I thought about the grant proposal sitting in my bag that I was supposed to finish for the Ontario Animal Health Network by Wednesday. It has its moments, I said. My mother-in-law beamed at me from across the table. She loved it when I was agreeable. The thing about being underestimated is that it stops bothering you after a while, or rather, it bothers you differently. At first it's an insult, then it becomes background noise, then eventually it becomes almost useful, a kind of protective camouflage. People tell you things when they think you're not paying attention. They relax around you. They stop performing. I had learned a great deal about my husband's family over 6 years of being underestimated at their table. I knew that his brother had made some investments in 2022 that hadn't gone the way he'd hoped, and that he was quietly leveraged against the family property portfolio in ways that his parents didn't fully understand. I knew that my mother-in-law was embarrassed that her daughter-in-law didn't have a graduate degree, even though I had a doctor of veterinary medicine and a master of veterinary science, because the concept of those degrees didn't fit comfortably into her existing understanding of women who work with animals. I knew that my father-in-law had, twice in the past year, asked my husband quiet questions about what exactly I did and whether it was going well, and that my husband had said, yeah, she's great, she runs the place, without it quite landing. What I didn't know going into that particular spring was that all of this was about to become relevant in a concrete and somewhat spectacular way. It started with a dog, not metaphorically, an actual dog. A Bernese mountain dog named Biscuit. Yes, Biscuit, I didn't name him, belonging to a woman named Margot, who was a senior partner at one of the larger Bay Street law firms in Toronto. Margot had been referred to our clinic by her neighbor after Biscuit developed what turned out to be a fairly complex gastrointestinal obstruction. I performed the surgery. It went well. Biscuit went home 3 days later, and Margot sent flowers to the clinic, and a handwritten note that I pinned to the board in the break room because it made the staff happy. 2 months after that, Margot called me directly. Not about Biscuit. About a position on a provincial advisory panel being assembled by the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs to review standards for large-scale animal welfare in commercial operations. She'd been asked to recommend professionals with both clinical expertise and administrative experience, and my name had come up through the OVMA. Would I be interested in being considered? I said I'd need to think about it. I thought about it for approximately 4 hours and then I said yes. I didn't tell my husband's family, not because I was hiding it, but because it simply didn't come up. We weren't at a Sunday dinner for a few weeks. His parents were at the cottage, and when we were together again, the conversation was about his brother's new car, and whether his mother's knee was improving, and could someone please help set up the new television in the living room. The appointment was confirmed in late May. My name, credentials, and position appeared in a ministry press release. It was not front-page news. It was, in fact, quite quiet, but the press release existed on the internet as press releases do. My father-in-law found it. I don't know exactly how. My husband thinks he was doing some routine searching. Maybe someone had mentioned my name. Maybe he'd just been curious. Whatever the reason, one afternoon in early June, my father-in-law called my husband and asked very carefully whether he was aware that his wife had been appointed to a provincial advisory panel for the Ministry of Agriculture. My husband said yes, of course, absolutely, he knew all about it. He then called me and asked if I could fill him in on what that meant exactly, because he'd said yes and now he needed to know. I told him. I kept it brief. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Does my mother know? He asked. I haven't mentioned it. Another pause. Okay, he said. Okay, can I tell her? You can tell whoever you want, I said. It's not a secret. The Sunday dinner 2 weeks later was, in retrospect, a masterclass in how a family processes information it should have had years earlier but is only now receiving. My mother-in-law asked me to explain what the panel actually did. I explained it. She nodded with great seriousness. She asked if it was a paid position. I said it came with an honorarium, yes. She asked how I'd been chosen. I said through a professional recommendation and a review of my credentials. She said, well, that's wonderful, and then turned to her husband and said, did you know she had all these credentials? He looked at me across the table with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. It was, I thought, something close to respect. Maybe closer to recognition. My brother-in-law took a different approach. He waited until after dinner, when we were all standing around in the kitchen, and then he said, pleasantly casually, in the same tone as you had once used to, my car was due for an oil change. I have to say, I always thought veterinary medicine was a bit small scale. For someone obviously intelligent, no offense. Untaken, I said. I mean, you're clearly capable of more. I looked at him for a moment. His wife, who had joined us for the first time that evening, was standing slightly behind him and had gone very still in the way of someone who has learned to become invisible when their husband is about to say something they'll later have to apologize for. More than what? I asked. You know, more than animals. I refilled my coffee. I manage a clinical team of 42 people, I said conversationally. Our annual operating budget is just over $4 million. I sit on the Disciplinary Review Board. I'm currently on a provincial advisory panel. Last year I was asked to contribute to a chapter in a veterinary surgical textbook being published through the University of Guelph, and last Thursday I was working at 2 in the morning because a dog needed me to. I took a sip of my coffee, but I do also work with animals, yes. That part's accurate. The kitchen was quiet. His wife made a small sound that she turned into a cough. My husband, who was leaning against the counter, was looking at me with an expression I would have paid money to photograph. My mother-in-law said $4 million. Operating budget, I said. It's a busy clinic. My father-in-law laughed. It was a short, quiet laugh, but it was genuine. I owe you an apology, he said. I don't think we've ever properly asked what you do. You're asking now, I said. That's fine. It would be tidy to say that was the moment everything changed, but that's not how families work. Families work slowly, they update in increments. My mother-in-law did not suddenly become a different woman. She continued to introduce me to people as very dedicated to her work, but she began saying it with a different inflection, one that sounded less like an explanation and more like a point of pride. My brother-in-law did not apologize, not directly, but he stopped offering me opinions about my professional choices, which in practice meant roughly the same thing. What changed more immediately was my relationship with my father-in-law. He called me the following week on a Wednesday morning, not to chat but because he'd been doing some thinking. His firm had recently acquired a large property in the Niagara region that had previously operated as an equine facility. Boarding, some training, and it had sat vacant for almost 2 years while they worked through some zoning complications. He was now trying to figure out what to do with it. He'd spoken to a few commercial developers. He was wondering if I might have any thoughts about the animal welfare regulatory landscape for facilities of that type, given that I was now somewhat connected to those conversations at a provincial level. I told him I'd be happy to talk through it. We had lunch the following Friday. He asked good questions. He listened to the answers. At the end of the meal, he put down his fork and said, "My son told me you run the place, but I didn't really hear it. I think I do now." It took a while, I said. "That's on us," he said. "I want to be clear about that. That's on us." I appreciated that he said it plainly. Most people don't. The panel work took up a significant portion of my next 18 months. It was not glamorous. Most regulatory work isn't, but it was the kind of thing I'd wanted to be part of for a long time. We reviewed inspection standards, assessed compliance frameworks, looked at where the existing guidelines had gaps, particularly around large-scale operations in rural Ontario that fell between the jurisdictions of municipal and provincial oversight. The recommendations we submitted in the spring went to the minister's office for review. Margot emailed me the day the summary was published. The subject line said, "Biscuit sends his regards." My husband read the summary when it came out. He read it carefully, which was not a thing he always did with documents of that kind. Afterward, he was quiet for a bit, and then he said, "I should have been louder about this." "About what?" "About what you do." "I should have been louder about it with my family. I let them just not know. For years, and I told myself it didn't matter because you weren't bothered by it. But that's not really the point, is it?" It wasn't a question, he knew the answer. "No," I said, "it's not really the point." "I'm sorry," he said. "That's all I've got, I'm sorry." It was enough. We'd been together for 12 years by then. I knew him well enough to know that when he said something plainly without hedging, he meant it. The Sunday dinners continued, as Sunday dinners do. My mother-in-law learned to say chief of staff instead of works at a vet clinic, and she said it with the slightly rehearsed care of someone who has recently updated a piece of information they've held wrong for a long time. It was in its way touching. My brother-in-law and I reached an equilibrium. He asked me once, several months later, whether I'd ever considered going into human medicine. He meant it as a compliment, I think, which says something about where his understanding still lived. And I said that veterinary medicine was exactly where I'd wanted to be, and that I found it considerably more interesting than most people expected. He nodded. He seemed to be genuinely trying to recalibrate. I gave him credit for that. His wife, as it turned out, was a civil engineer who had spent 7 years on the team that designed a major transit expansion project in Hamilton. She mentioned this at a Christmas dinner, quietly, almost in passing, and there was a brief moment where the whole table registered that they had been having opinions about her professional choices for years, without actually knowing what those choices were. It was a familiar moment. I recognized it immediately. I caught her eye across the table. She gave me a very small, very dry smile. "Low-pressure work?" I said. "Very steady," she said. We laughed at the same time, and my mother-in-law looked between us with the cheerful confusion of someone who has missed a private joke but is glad everyone is getting along. Biscuit, for what it's worth, is doing beautifully. He came in for his annual last fall, big and ridiculous and full of opinions about the scale in the exam room, and Margot mentioned, while I was checking his chart, that the ministry had cited our panel's work in a new set of proposed amendments that were going to public consultation in the new year. I wrote it in the chart notes. Annual exam, patient in excellent health. Owner reports good winter, lots of hiking. Provincial regulatory work cited in proposed amendments. Biscuit unimpressed. I drove home through the gray November light and thought about all the Sunday dinners, all the salad fork gestures, all the very sweet, very dedicated, and I imagine it must be nice, low pressure. And I didn't feel bitter about any of it. Bitterness would require that I'd been waiting for the moment to arrive. I hadn't been waiting. I'd just been working. The window of a burned bridge, I've always thought, lets in a particular kind of light, cold and clear and completely honest. You can see everything better without the smoke.